your book?
One of the things in New Zealand is that you've got a lot of people doing things in the outdoors.
Yes.
People tramping or boating or even using light aircraft. And they all need to know about the weather.
Yes. But
it's also a subject that I think is very interesting. So I've tried to include stories in here, sometimes from history. The storm that we had in New Zealand in 1936, I think, is the worst to have hit New Zealand in the last 100 years. And if we had another one of those in the near future, people would be absolutely gobsmacked by how much damage there would be. Plus the fact that that was interesting in that it affected the entire North Island and Marlborough, whereas what we've seen in my lifetime as a forecaster has been storms having their worst effect in just 2 or 3 provinces, not in 10 or 12 provinces. So the 1936 cyclone was a thing where you wouldn't find your neighbours in a position to come down the road and help you because they'd be in as much trouble as you were. So for disaster people, I've often drawn attention to the fact that we've had one of these things before. I know of no reason why we couldn't have another one. And the good thing about telling stories about the weather is you get stories back. So I've now learned about a snow event in 1939 which affected the entire country. It snowed at the lighthouse at the top end of the North Island. There was 5 centimetres of snow on Mount Eden in Auckland. It went on for some time and there were places not getting much snow that got bad frost. So in Wellington, 8 hectares of the harbour in Parramatta froze solid. Wow. And in many places pipes were bursting and affecting people's houses. And the worst affected place was Dunedin. They were cut off for 3 or 4 days. The snow was 1 metre deep in some of the suburbs there. And at the end of it all, there was another dose of snow in Invercargill, and they played a Ranfurly Shield game with 4 inches of snow on the ground. And they had to clear the touch lines and the goal line so that the players could navigate their way around the snow panel.
It's pretty tough down there.
They do. So the stories like that always seem to get people interested, and what I like is when I tell them I usually get stories back.
Well, it affects your everyday life, the weather.
Well, it does.
Yeah.
And one of the stories, they're not just stories about New Zealand, there's the weather map for D-Day I've got in here when we had the Allied invasion of France. There it is there. And that was a crucial event, and I say in here it's the forecast that saved 1 million lives, at least. Because if they'd got that wrong, the Allies wouldn't have been able to invade Europe for another year. And if the war had gone on for another 12 months, longer than it did, you can easily imagine that sort of thing. One of the people involved with this was a New Zealander, and he actually went to school with my father in Auckland, and he was in the Royal Navy. He's still alive, he's in his 90s now, living in the south of France. But when I told people in Dunedin about that, they immediately said, no, he wasn't from Auckland, he was from Dunedin. And when I checked it, I found there was a second New Zealander who was from Dunedin, and he was with the United States Army Air Force. He'd gone to MIT in 1937, and when the war started he joined up with them. So we had one forecaster from the Royal Navy and one with the American Air Force.
Wow.
So it was quite a big contribution from a small country.
And I guess that's where we're coming from today, is if we can forecast things that save lives,
absolutely.
That's our business, is preparing for an emergency. Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things I often say, I wrote an editorial about this once, is that when people hear the forecast and choose not to put themselves at risk, not to go out in a small boat, you never see the newspaper headline the next day saying blogs and family alive and well because they stayed at home and watched TV. But that happens many times. What makes the news and the TV is when someone is in trouble in a boat. And in my experience of checking up most of those situations, the forecasts were reasonably accurate. And for some reason they either didn't get one or they ignored it, and either people die or people get in trouble and people have to go out in helicopters and rescue them. So it's a message I try to get across. With tramping, I often say to people, a river in full flood no one will walk into because you'll die. But it's the river that you could cross 3 times out of 4 and get away with it. That's the one you step into, and then you roll your foot off a rock and you're away. So it's hammering away at the cautionary thing. There is I think a lot of people don't quite realise how useful the forecasts are, because if they're not doing work that involves putting themselves at risk from the viewpoint of the weather, They don't notice that the forecast is right as often as it is, and they can sometimes be a little bit cavalier. So I encourage respect for the forecast as much as I can. Not to say that we're perfect, but we're pretty good.
Absolutely. And how can we get hold of a copy of your book?
It's in a number of bookshops. It's published by Craig Potton, so you can always get your bookshop to ask Craig Potton to send them a copy if they don't have one on hand. So the normal channels, basically.
Excellent. Is there anything else that you want to add, thinking disaster, emergency preparedness?
I think we sort of covered everything.
I think we have too.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's all right.